October 17, 1931, United States District Court, Chicago, Illinois. Al Capone sat in the defendant's chair, his trademark smile nowhere to be found. The most powerful gangster in America, a man who had murdered his way to the top, who controlled politicians, judges, and police chiefs, was about to hear his fate. Not for the estimated 300 murders his organization had committed. Not for the speakeasies, brothels, and gambling dens that generated $50 million a year. No. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was going down for not paying his taxes. Somewhere in Chicago, a young federal agent named Eliot Ness learned of the verdict. 30 years old, wire-rimmed glasses, suit pressed to military precision. He had spent 2 years raiding Capone's breweries, smashing his trucks, and humiliating him in the press. According to Ness's later account, Capone had offered him $2,000 a week to look the other way. Ness had turned it down and made the bribe attempt public. Now, as the judge sentenced Capone to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion, Ness understood what they'd accomplished. The newspapers would credit the Internal Revenue Service for the conviction, and they were right. Frank Wilson's patient financial investigation had built the tax case that brought Capone down. But Ness and his team had played a crucial role, disrupting Capone's operations, generating public pressure, and demonstrating that federal agents couldn't all be bought. Together, the IRS accountants and the Prohibition raiders had done something no one thought possible in Chicago. They had remained honest long enough to matter. This is the story of how they did it. Chicago, 1929. The city pulses with an energy that's part innovation, part violence. The stockyards process meat for the nation. The railroads converge here, making it the logistics hub of America. Skyscrapers climb toward the clouds. Jazz pours from nightclub doors. And beneath it all, corruption runs like a second sewer system, invisible but essential to the city's function. Al Capone doesn't just operate in this city. He owns it. By 1929, his criminal organization employs over 700 people. His syndicate controls the production and distribution of illegal alcohol throughout Chicago and much of the Midwest. The Prohibition Bureau estimates his income at $100 million annually, roughly $1.5 billion in today's currency. He operates breweries, distilleries, speakeasies, gambling houses, and brothels. His headquarters, the Lexington Hotel at 2135 South Michigan Avenue, functions like a city hall for the underworld. Politicians come to him. Police captains report to him. Judges rule the way he wants. The violence is industrial in scale. On February 14, 1929, St. Valentine's Day, Capone's men massacre 7 members of George Bugs Moran's gang in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. They line them against a wall and execute them with Thompson submachine guns. The killers are dressed as police officers. Many believe the actual Chicago police were compromised. Capone had officers on his payroll all over the city. No one is prosecuted. This is the system. Crime doesn't hide in Chicago. It parades down Michigan Avenue in custom suits and armored Cadillacs. Al Capone attends the opera. He tips waiters with $100 bills. He donates to charities and opens soup kitchens during the Depression. The newspapers call him public enemy number 1, but on the street some people call him a hero. He gives them what they want, alcohol, and he does it with style. The federal government has a problem. Local law enforcement is either terrified or bought. State authorities are compromised. Traditional investigation methods fail because witnesses disappear, evidence vanishes, and jury members receive visits in the night. You can't fight Capone with normal police work because Capone controls the police. So they try something different. Eliot Ness was born on April 19, 1903 in Chicago. The youngest of 5 children, son of Norwegian immigrants raised in the Kensington neighborhood. His father, a baker. His mother, strict, religious, suspicious of alcohol even before Prohibition. Young Elliot was bookish, disciplined, athletic. He attended the University of Chicago, studying commerce, business, and law. He graduated in 1925, just as the Bureau of Prohibition was desperately seeking educated recruits. His brother-in-law, Alexander Jamie, was an FBI agent. Jamie saw something in the young man, integrity paired with competence, a rare combination. He helped Ness get a job with the Bureau of Prohibition in 1927. Ness was 24 years old. For the first few years, Ness worked routine cases, small-time bootleggers, speakeasy raids, surveillance assignments. He learned how the system worked. More importantly, he learned how it didn't work. He watched agents take bribes. He saw evidence disappear. He observed senior officials who suddenly drove expensive cars on government salaries. He remained clean. He built a reputation. In 1929, George Emery Quincy Johnson became the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. Johnson was that rare creature in Chicago politics, genuinely clean. He'd been appointed by President Herbert Hoover with a specific mandate: destroy Al Capone's organization. But Johnson understood the fundamental problem. Capone didn't fear the law. He owned too much of it. Traditional prosecution was impossible. Working with Treasury Intelligence Unit Chief Elmer Eyre and IRS Special Agent Frank J. Wilson, Johnson conceived a strategy. The IRS would investigate Capone for tax evasion, a federal crime beyond the reach of local corruption. Meanwhile, a separate unit would attack Capone's revenue stream directly, destroy his breweries, seize his trucks, and cost him so much money that he'd be forced into mistakes. The raids would also document the scale of his operations, providing evidence of the income sources Wilson's team needed to prove. For this enforcement mission, Johnson needed someone who couldn't be bought. He chose Eliot Ness. The selection process was deliberate. Johnson and federal officials identified agents with clean records. They checked for any compromising associations through informal investigations and reference checks. They needed men who had turned down bribes, men who couldn't be blackmailed, men whose families were clean. They found very few. In September 1929, Johnson called Ness into his office. The conversation was brief. Johnson explained the mission: form a special unit, focus exclusively on Capone's liquor operations, and stay honest. Ness asked one question: how much support will we have? Johnson's answer was honest. Limited. You'll have some resources, vehicles, equipment, authority, but you'll face constant obstruction from corrupt officials. Every compromised cop in Chicago will be reporting your movements to Capone. You'll have federal authority and my backing. Ness accepted immediately. He was 26 years old. He had no idea he was about to become a legend. Ness understood he couldn't do this alone. He needed a team. But more importantly, he needed the right team. Every man would be investigated, tested, and trusted, absolutely. One corrupt agent could destroy the entire operation. He started by reviewing personnel files at the Prohibition Bureau, the Treasury Department, and even the Chicago Police Department. He looked for specific qualities: clean service record, no disciplinary issues, no signs of unexplained wealth, no known associations with organized crime. He also looked for something harder to quantify: moral courage, the ability to say no when everyone else was saying yes. The first man he selected was Marty Lahart. Born in 1898, Irish-American, a former college athlete who had worked for the Prohibition Bureau since the early 1920s. Lahart had survived nearly a decade in one of the most corrupt agencies in government without taking a single bribe. He'd been passed over for promotions, isolated from the good assignments, treated as a Boy Scout in an agency of bagmen. But he'd stayed clean. Ness trusted that. Next was Samuel Maurice Seeger, a capable investigator who understood surveillance and evidence gathering. Born in 1900, Seeger had served in World War I and joined federal law enforcement in 1921. He was methodical, careful, and incorruptible. He'd turned down bribes worth many times his annual salary. Barney Clunan came next. Born in 1895, another Irish-American, a physical specimen who'd worked in law enforcement before joining the Prohibition Bureau. Clunan was fearless. He understood how liquor moved through the city, how distribution networks operated, where the weak points were. He'd been shot at during enforcement operations and came back the next day. Then came Lyle Chapman. Born in 1902, a University of California graduate who'd moved to Chicago for federal service. Chapman was young, educated, and analytical. He could read ledgers, understand business operations, and identify patterns in seemingly random data. He'd never taken a dime. Paul Robsky was recruited from the Prohibition Bureau's Chicago office. Born in 1901, Robsky could work undercover, investigating speakeasies, identifying suppliers, gathering intelligence. He was known for walking away from bribe attempts without even acknowledging them. Joseph Leeson joined the team next. Born in 1899, a college-educated agent who'd worked for the Prohibition Bureau in multiple cities, Leeson had experience with raid operations, evidence handling, and courtroom testimony. He was detail-oriented and understood that good police work was as much about documentation as action. Thomas Friel came from the Chicago Police Department, one of the few clean cops left. Born in 1895, Irish-American, a patrolman who'd repeatedly refused offers to play ball. He'd been demoted, reassigned to terrible districts, and threatened. He stayed honest. Ness wanted him precisely because he'd survived in a corrupt environment without becoming corrupt himself. William Gardner was another Prohibition Bureau veteran. Born in 1897, Gardner had spent years working liquor cases across the Midwest. He understood the technical side, how stills operated, how beer was brewed, how liquor was aged and cut. He could look at a facility and immediately identify its capacity and value to Capone's operation. Finally, James Seeley. Born in 1900, a Prohibition agent who'd worked undercover and survived. Seeley was quiet, observant, and completely reliable. He'd been offered enormous bribes in the tens of thousands of dollars. He reported every single one. Approximately 10 men formed the core team. Later, the press would call them the Untouchables, but that name wouldn't come for months. In September 1929, they were just federal agents with a dangerous assignment and no guarantee of survival. Ness gathered them in a small office at the Transportation Building at 608 South Dearborn Street. The office was deliberately chosen, away from the main Prohibition Bureau offices, isolated from the agents who'd already been compromised. Ness explained the mission in plain language. They would target Capone's breweries. They would seize his trucks. They would destroy his equipment. They would document his operations to help build evidence of his income. They would cost him millions. And they would do it without accepting a single dollar from anyone. He gave each man an out. Walk away now, no questions asked, no judgment. No one left. They understood what this meant. Capone would offer them money, then threats, then violence. Some of them would probably die. But for the first time in Chicago's Prohibition history, a group of law enforcement officers was going to attack organized crime without being on the payroll. The next morning, they went to work. Ness began with intelligence gathering. Before raiding a single brewery, he needed to understand Capone's entire operation. How many facilities? Where were they located? What was their production capacity? How was the beer distributed? Where were the weak points? The team set up surveillance operations. This was delicate work, identifying locations used by Capone's organization, observing patterns, avoiding detection by corrupt officials who might report the surveillance. Some wiretapping was conducted, though the technical details of these operations remain unclear in historical records. The surveillance revealed the structure. Capone's liquor operation was industrial in scale. He controlled multiple major breweries in Chicago and the surrounding area. Each facility could produce hundreds of barrels per week. The beer was loaded onto trucks and delivered to thousands of speakeasies, restaurants, and private clubs across the city. The trucks were often escorted by armed guards. The drivers were told to run from police, and if caught, to claim they didn't know who owned the cargo. The system was efficient, profitable, and protected by a network of paid officials at every level. Ness identified a large brewery facility on the south side, operating under the cover of a legitimate business. The building was substantial, with multiple delivery bays. Intelligence suggested significant production capacity, hundreds of barrels weekly, generating substantial revenue for Capone's organization. In early 1930, Ness planned his first major raid. He told almost no one. Even within his own unit, only the men participating knew the target. He didn't inform the Chicago Police Department. Too many corrupt officers. He didn't notify the local Prohibition Bureau office. Too many leaks. He requested backup from federal agents based in other cities, men who had no connection to Chicago's compromise system. In the early morning hours, Ness and his team surrounded the facility. They'd brought trucks. They intended to seize everything: axes, sledgehammers, equipment for forced entry. They breached the doors and entered with weapons drawn. Inside was a fully operational brewery. Massive vats, fermentation tanks, bottling equipment, barrels ready for delivery. The building smelled of yeast, hops, and steam. Workers were on site. Most fled. The team secured the facility and began documenting evidence: ledgers, delivery records, equipment. Then they began the destruction. They poured beer down drains. They disabled the equipment. They seized trucks. By dawn, the facility was no longer operational. Ness had photographs taken. He wanted the press to see this. The raid netted evidence: business records showing the scale of operations, trucks registered to front companies, and documentation that would help prove the income sources for Wilson's tax investigation. Cost to Capone: significant loss in equipment, product, and ongoing revenue. The newspapers covered the raid. Ness made sure they did. He gave interviews, explained the operation, and made it clear this was just the beginning. He wanted Capone to know that the rules had changed. Capone wasn't worried, not yet. He'd seen reform efforts before. They always ended the same way: either the reformers took money, or they got scared, or they got killed. He expected Ness would be no different. He was wrong. Over the next 18 months, Ness's unit conducted raid after raid. They developed a pattern: intelligence gathering through surveillance, careful planning to avoid leaks, sudden overwhelming force, destruction or seizure of equipment, meticulous documentation for legal proceedings, and immediate press coverage. Throughout 1930 and into 1931, they hit breweries and distribution facilities across Chicago. They destroyed equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars. They seized trucks. They disrupted distribution networks. They documented the scale and scope of Capone's operations. The raids continued through the seasons. Each month brought new targets. Ness varied the timing, the locations, the approach. He kept Capone's organization off balance. They couldn't predict where he'd strike next because he shared plans with almost no one. The financial impact was substantial. The Prohibition Bureau estimated that Ness's raids had cost Capone's organization significant amounts in destroyed equipment and seized product, plus disrupted revenue streams. For the first time since Prohibition began, Al Capone's alcohol empire was under sustained, systematic attack. But money wasn't the only impact. Ness was humiliating Capone. Every raid was covered in newspapers. Photographers captured images of federal agents destroying equipment, barrels being poured out, trucks being seized. Ness made sure he was photographed at scenes: young, well-dressed, confident. The message was clear: Capone couldn't protect his own operations. In the criminal underworld, reputation is currency. Capone's reputation was taking damage. His distributors worried about reliability. His speakeasy owners complained about spotty supply. His rivals sensed weakness. Capone decided it was time to make the problem go away. According to Ness's later account in his memoir, The Untouchables, written with Oscar Fraley in 1957, an approach came from Capone's organization in early 1931. Ness described how intermediaries made contact, never mentioning Capone by name, offering what he claimed was $2,000 per week in exchange for redirecting his attention away from Capone's facilities. $2,000 per week in 1931 would be equivalent to approximately $35,000 per week today, roughly 37 times Ness's annual federal salary. More than most executives earned, certainly more than any federal agent could hope to see in a lifetime of honest work. Whether the exact details occurred as Ness later described is uncertain. Historians note that his memoir took significant dramatic license. But what is documented is that bribery of Prohibition agents was endemic, and Ness did refuse offers and publicize his team's incorruptibility. Ness went to George Johnson's office, and they decided to go public with the concept of an incorruptible team. Ness worked with the press to publicize his unit's refusal to accept bribes from the organizations they were investigating. He made clear that his team would not be corrupted. He stated that attempts to bribe federal agents would be treated as additional crimes and prosecuted accordingly. The newspapers embraced the narrative. A reporter coined the phrase that would define them, the Untouchables. The name stuck. For Ness, the public emphasis on incorruptibility was effective. By making his team's honesty a matter of public record, he'd created accountability. He'd also sent a message to his own team. We're committed to this publicly, irrevocably. There's no turning back. For Capone, dealing with agents who wouldn't take money was frustrating. He'd never encountered Chicago law enforcement officers who couldn't be bought. Capone decided that if Ness couldn't be bought, perhaps he could be intimidated. The threats came in various forms during 1931. Ness and his team faced intimidation, surveillance by corrupt police officers, reports of their movements being passed to Capone's organization, and a generally hostile environment from compromised officials. According to some accounts, there was an attempt on Ness's life involving a drive-by shooting, though details are sparse and difficult to verify in historical records. Team members reported threats and intimidation tactics, damaged property, menacing phone calls, and surveillance of their families. The most documented incident involved Barney Clunan. A crude explosive device was found attached to his vehicle. A police bomb squad dismantled it before it could detonate. The investigation found no conclusive evidence linking it to any specific individual, though everyone suspected Capone's organization. The pressure was real. Team members faced hostility from corrupt officials within law enforcement. Their families endured stress. Corrupt Chicago police officers would surveil them, sending a clear message about their vulnerability. Ness responded by taking security precautions and increasing the pace of raids. The worse the intimidation became, the harder he hit Capone's operations. But privately, Ness worried. Not for himself, he'd accepted that risk, but for his team. These men had families, children, wives who hadn't signed up for this. The danger was real, even if not as dramatically cinematic as later accounts would suggest. The team held together. In meetings, the consensus was clear. Quitting would mean Capone won. If federal agents could be intimidated into abandoning legitimate law enforcement operations, then the rule of law meant nothing. They continued. While Ness was raiding breweries, a more methodical investigation was unfolding. The Internal Revenue Service had assigned its own team to the Capone case. Their mission was different from Ness's. They weren't trying to stop the liquor trade. They were trying to prove that Capone had earned substantial income and hadn't paid taxes on it. This sounds simple. It was anything but. Al Capone was intelligent about his money. He owned nothing in his own name. No property, no cars, no bank accounts. Everything was registered to front men, shell corporations, and associates. He paid for everything in cash. He signed no checks. He had no salary, no documented employment, no official income. The IRS team was led by Special Agent Frank Wilson, working under Treasury Intelligence Unit Chief Elmer Eyre. Born in 1887 in Buffalo, New York, Wilson had joined the intelligence unit in 1920. He was methodical, tireless, and brilliant with numbers. He understood that organized crime was fundamentally a business, and every business leaves a paper trail. Wilson's strategy was patient. He couldn't prove Capone owned the breweries. Capone was too careful. But he could prove that someone was earning enormous amounts of money from the Chicago liquor trade. If he could connect that money to Capone, even indirectly, he'd have a tax evasion case. He started with Capone's spending. The gangster lived at the Lexington Hotel in an expensive suite. He traveled extensively, always first class. He wore custom suits that cost hundreds of dollars each. He gambled heavily. He threw lavish parties. He supported a sprawling extended family. Wilson documented what expenses he could verify. Hotel bills, travel tickets, custom tailoring, jewelry purchases. He built a profile of a man spending hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. But spending isn't income. Wilson needed proof of where the money came from. He found it in financial records. Capone's organization was sophisticated but not perfect. Bookkeepers kept records. They had to track the enormous flow of cash through the operation. Wilson needed those ledgers. IRS agents raided gambling houses, speakeasies, and suspected fronts, looking for any documentation. Most raids found nothing. The bookkeepers were warned. They burned records, hid ledgers, destroyed evidence. But in 1930, IRS agents raiding a gambling establishment found ledgers that had survived, records showing gambling operations and payments flowing upward to bosses. The ledgers showed substantial income from illegal operations. Wilson needed to connect this income to Al Capone personally. He found former Capone employees who'd fallen out with the organization. Wilson offered them immunity in exchange for testimony. Some agreed to testify that they'd personally handled cash payments to Capone, and that Capone had received substantial income from gambling and bootlegging operations. He also found former associates willing to testify under federal protection about the financial structure of Capone's organization. By mid-1931, Wilson had built a case. He could prove Capone had received substantial income from gambling and bootlegging. He could prove Capone had not filed income tax returns during the relevant years. He could prove Capone owed hundreds of thousands in back taxes. It wasn't as dramatic as Ness's raids. There were no axes, no destroyed breweries, no newspaper photographs. But it was solid. Numbers don't lie. Financial records don't take bribes. Math doesn't forget. George Johnson, the U.S. attorney, understood that the two investigations were complementary. Ness's raids had documented the scale of Capone's liquor operations, providing evidence that massive income was being generated from illegal sources. Wilson's investigation had traced that income to Capone and proven he hadn't paid taxes on it. Together, they had a case that couldn't be bought off or intimidated into disappearing. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on 22 counts of income tax evasion. The trial began on October 6, 1931, at the United States District Court in Chicago, Judge James Herbert Wilkerson presiding. The prosecution was led by U.S. Attorney George Johnson, assisted by a team of federal prosecutors. Capone's defense was handled by some of the most expensive lawyers in America. Capone arrived at the courthouse in a custom suit, flanked by bodyguards. He smiled for photographers. He shook hands with supporters. He appeared confident. There were persistent rumors that Capone's organization had attempted to influence the jury, though no verified evidence exists of successful bribery in this case. Judge Wilkerson had heard rumors of potential jury tampering. On the morning of trial, he made an announcement. He was swapping juries with another courtroom. The jury that would hear the Capone case was a completely different panel, selected that morning, unknown to the defense. Capone's confidence faltered. The prosecution's case was methodical. They called witnesses who testified to Capone's lavish lifestyle, the expensive hotel suite, the custom clothing, the luxury travel. They introduced evidence of property purchases made by frontmen on Capone's behalf. They showed that Capone lived like a millionaire. Then they introduced the ledgers and financial records. Frank Wilson testified about the gambling house records and financial documentation his team had uncovered. He explained how the evidence showed substantial income from illegal operations flowing to Capone's organization. Former employees and associates testified under immunity agreements. They described their roles in Capone's organization and confirmed that Capone had received substantial income from gambling and bootlegging operations. They provided details about cash payments and the financial structure of the criminal enterprise. The defense attacked the credibility of the witnesses. They argued that some were disgruntled ex-employees testifying for immunity. They suggested the financial records could be interpreted differently, that income could have belonged to various people in the organization. But the mathematics was undeniable. The prosecution had documented that between 1924 and 1929, Al Capone had received substantial traceable income. They proved he'd filed no tax returns during those years. They showed he owed approximately $215,000 in back taxes and penalties. The defense couldn't explain away the numbers. They tried to argue that Capone didn't know tax law, that he'd relied on accountants who'd failed him, that he was just a businessman who'd made mistakes. But ignorance of the law isn't a defense. Eliot Ness didn't testify at the trial. His role had been to document the bootlegging operations and disrupt Capone's business. The actual tax case was built by Wilson's IRS team. But Ness followed the trial closely, understanding that his raids had contributed to proving the income sources that made the tax prosecution possible. On October 17, 1931, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. guilty on 5 of the 22 counts. Judge Wilkerson sentenced Capone on October 24th. 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. Additionally, Capone was ordered to pay his back taxes, plus interest and penalties, and was fined $50,000. Al Capone's organization had killed hundreds of people. He'd bribed thousands of officials. He'd corrupted an entire city. But in the end, he went to prison for not paying his taxes. As federal marshals led Capone from the courtroom, the era of his dominance over Chicago was over. The most powerful gangster in America had just lost to a combination of IRS accountants and federal agents he couldn't buy, intimidate, or kill. Al Capone served his time in 3 facilities. First, the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. Then, in August 1934, he was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, becoming one of its first inmates. He was prisoner number 85. Alcatraz was designed for prisoners like Capone, men whose wealth and connections made them dangerous even behind bars. At Alcatraz, there were no special privileges, no bribes worked, no connections mattered. Capone was just another inmate. He was never the same. He'd contracted syphilis years earlier, probably in his 20s. He'd never sought proper treatment. Antibiotics didn't exist yet, and the treatments available were painful and unreliable. By the late 1930s, the disease had progressed to neurosyphilis, attacking his brain. He began showing symptoms of dementia. He had difficulty remembering, trouble speaking, and episodes of confusion. By 1938, he was exhibiting severe mental deterioration. In 1939, he was transferred from Alcatraz to the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island in California. He was released on November 16, 1939, after serving 7.5 years of his sentence, with time off for good behavior. He retired to his estate in Miami Beach, Florida. By then, his mental capacity was severely diminished. He spent his final years in cognitive decline, confused about where he was and what had happened to his empire. He died on January 25, 1947, of cardiac arrest following a stroke. He was 48 years old. His criminal organization fragmented after his imprisonment. Without his leadership, the various factions fought for control. Some fled Chicago, others went to prison. The empire he'd built crumbled. Prohibition ended in 1933, rendering the entire bootlegging industry moot. The violence continued through the 1930s, but organized crime in Chicago never again reached the industrial scale it had achieved under Capone. Eliot Ness became a national celebrity. After Capone's conviction, newspapers ran profiles of the young agent who'd refused bribes and lived to tell about it. He was handsome, photogenic, and articulate. He gave interviews. He was invited to speak at civic organizations. He was the face of federal law enforcement success. In 1933, Ness was transferred to Cincinnati and then to Cleveland, where he was appointed Director of Public Safety in 1935. He was tasked with cleaning up the Cleveland Police Department, which was nearly as corrupt as Chicago's had been. He applied the same principles, investigated officers, fired corrupt officials, and refused to compromise. He had some success but made powerful enemies. In Cleveland, he also worked on the torso murderer case, a serial killer who murdered and dismembered at least 12 victims between 1935 and 1938. The case was never solved, and it damaged Ness's reputation. The newspapers that had once celebrated him now criticized his inability to catch the killer. The reality was that forensic science in the 1930s was primitive, and serial killer investigations were not well understood. But the public expected results from the man who'd taken down Al Capone. Ness's personal life deteriorated. His first marriage, to Edna Staley in 1929, ended in divorce in 1938. The pressure of the Capone years, the constant danger, and his growing celebrity had strained the relationship beyond repair. He married again in 1939 to Evelyn McAndrew, a fashion illustrator. That marriage lasted 6 years before also ending in divorce. He left public service in 1942. The Cleveland political establishment had turned against him after he backed the wrong candidate for mayor. He was essentially forced out. He tried various business ventures, none particularly successful. He became a partner in a company that manufactured watermarking systems. He worked for a company that produced frozen hamburger patties. He drank heavily. The man who'd been incorruptible in the face of Al Capone's bribes was now struggling to pay rent. In 1955, Ness met Oscar Fraley, a sports journalist. Over drinks, Ness told stories about the Capone years. Fraley saw a book. They collaborated on a manuscript. Ness didn't live to see it published. On May 16, 1957, Eliot Ness died of a heart attack at his home in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. He was 54 years old. He was nearly broke. His third marriage, to artist Betty Seaver in 1946, had produced one son, Robert, adopted in 1946. The funeral was small. The obituaries were brief. The man who'd been a national hero 25 years earlier died in relative obscurity. 1 month after his death, The Untouchables was published. The book became a bestseller. It was adapted into a television series that ran from 1959 to 1963, starring Robert Stack as Eliot Ness. The show was hugely popular. Suddenly, Eliot Ness was famous again, or rather a fictionalized version of him was famous. The real man who'd done the work was gone, but the legend was just beginning. In 1987, director Brian De Palma made a film version, The Untouchables, starring Kevin Costner as Ness. The movie was dramatic, violent, and took significant liberties with the historical record. But it captured something true. The idea that in a corrupt system, integrity itself becomes a weapon. The other members of Ness's team lived quieter lives after the Capone case. Marty Lahart continued with the Prohibition Bureau and later worked for various federal agencies. He retired in the 1950s and died in 1970. He rarely spoke publicly about the Capone years, preferring to let Ness have the spotlight. Samuel Seeger continued working in federal law enforcement. He retired in the 1950s and died in 1968. Barney Clunan left federal service in the late 1930s. He survived the bomb attempt in 1931 and other close calls. He died in 1973. Lyle Chapman stayed with the Treasury Department, eventually rising to a senior position. He retired in the 1950s and died in 1977. He maintained that the Capone investigation was the most important work he ever did. Paul Robsky continued as a Prohibition agent until Prohibition ended, then worked in various federal law enforcement roles. He spoke occasionally about the Capone years, but never sought publicity. He died in 1975. Joseph Leeson remained with federal law enforcement through the 1940s. He testified in numerous other organized crime cases, using the documentation skills he'd developed during the Capone investigation. He died in 1962. Thomas Friel returned to the Chicago Police Department after the Capone case. He remained an anomaly, a clean cop in a dirty department. He retired in the 1950s and died in 1971. William Gardner continued working Prohibition cases and later other federal investigations. He retired in the 1950s and died in 1969. James Seeley stayed in federal service through World War II, working on various investigations. He died in 1965. None of them became wealthy. None of them sought fame. They'd done what they were asked to do, remain honest in a profoundly corrupt environment and take down a criminal who seemed untouchable. They succeeded. Then they went back to work. The Capone case established several precedents that changed American law enforcement. First, it proved that tax evasion prosecutions could succeed where traditional criminal prosecutions failed. When witnesses are intimidated, evidence disappears, and juries are corrupted, financial crimes offer an alternative path. The IRS doesn't need cooperative witnesses, it needs records. Numbers don't get scared. After Capone's conviction, federal prosecutors began applying this strategy to other organized crime figures. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, dozens of gangsters were prosecuted for tax evasion. The precedent became known as the Capone route. If you can't prove the murders, prove they didn't pay taxes on the murder money. Second, the case demonstrated the importance of incorruptible investigators. Ness's success wasn't primarily about brilliant detective work, though the team was certainly competent. It was about refusing bribes. In a system where everyone had a price, being priceless was itself a strategy. This lesson influenced how federal law enforcement agencies recruited and vetted agents. The idea of specially selected teams became standard practice. Third, it showed the value of publicity. Ness understood that his raids needed to be public. The photographs of federal agents destroying breweries, the press coverage of seizures, the public emphasis on incorruptibility, these sent a message that the government was finally serious. Perception mattered. Capone's power rested partly on his reputation as untouchable. Ness damaged that reputation. Fourth, the case proved the effectiveness of multi-agency coordination. Ness's Prohibition Bureau team provided evidence of income sources. Frank Wilson's IRS team proved the income wasn't reported. George Johnson's U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuted the case in federal court, beyond the reach of local corruption. The collaboration was essential. No single agency could have succeeded alone. But perhaps the most important legacy is harder to quantify. The Capone case demonstrated that even in a profoundly corrupt system, it's possible to act with integrity. This sounds obvious, but it wasn't and isn't. When everyone around you is taking bribes, when refusing money means accepting danger, when honesty can get your family threatened, the easiest path is to compromise. Most people do. The Untouchables didn't. This matters because corruption isn't just about individual bad actors. It's systemic. It creates an environment where honest people are punished and corrupt people are rewarded. Breaking that system requires people willing to accept personal costs for abstract principles. Ness and his team paid those costs. They faced real dangers. They put their families under stress. According to Ness's account, they turned down bribes that would have made them wealthy. They did this not because they were guaranteed success. They weren't. But because they believed the system should work according to its stated rules, not its actual practice. That belief was radical in 1930s Chicago. In many places and times it still is. The legend of the Untouchables has grown over the decades, particularly through television and film. The reality was both more mundane and more impressive than the legend suggests. The myth: Ness and his team engaged in dramatic shootouts with Capone's men, narrowly escaping death in spectacular car chases and gunfights. The reality: there were some threats and intimidation. The bomb under Cloonan's car is documented, and there are accounts of other incidents, though details are often sparse. But most of the work was surveillance, paperwork, and the physical labor of destroying brewery equipment. Real law enforcement is less cinematic than fiction suggests. The team's primary tools were axes and sledgehammers for raids, not machine guns and shootouts. The myth: Ness personally brought down Al Capone through brilliant detective work. The reality: Ness contributed significantly by damaging Capone's revenue stream, generating public pressure, and documenting the scale of operations. But the actual conviction came through Frank Wilson's patient financial investigation. The IRS accountants who traced money through ledgers deserve as much credit as the agents who raided breweries. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The myth: the Untouchables were a large, elite unit with significant resources. The reality: the core team numbered approximately 10 agents, working with limited resources and minimal support from a bureaucracy riddled with corruption. They succeeded despite limited resources, not because of overwhelming force. The federal government didn't throw money at the problem. It assigned a handful of honest agents and told them to figure it out. The myth: Capone's conviction ended organized crime in Chicago. The reality: organized crime continued for decades after Capone's imprisonment. The syndicate fragmented but didn't disappear. Other criminals filled the power vacuum. Corruption persisted in Chicago politics and law enforcement well into the late 20th century. The Capone case was a significant victory, but it wasn't the end of the war. The myth: Ness was a flawless hero, morally pure and professionally perfect. The reality: Ness was complicated. He was genuinely honest about money. There's no evidence he ever took a bribe, even when desperately broke later in life. But he struggled with alcohol, particularly after leaving federal service. His marriages failed. His later business ventures were often poorly conceived. He craved recognition and struggled when it faded. He was human, capable of integrity in some areas while failing in others. The myth matters because it inspires. The legend of the Untouchables has influenced generations of law enforcement officers, suggesting that it's possible to remain honest even in corrupt environments. That's valuable, even if the legend simplifies complex reality. But the reality matters more because it's true. Ness and his team weren't superhuman. They were federal agents with average salaries, doing difficult work under dangerous conditions, choosing integrity when corruption would have been easier and more profitable. That's more impressive than any myth. Because if they could do it, others can too. The Prohibition era that made Al Capone possible was itself a massive policy failure. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. The Volstead Act, passed later that year, provided federal enforcement mechanisms. The intention was to reduce crime, improve public health, and elevate public morality. The result was the opposite. Prohibition created a massive black market worth billions of dollars. Criminal organizations grew exponentially to meet demand for illegal alcohol. Corruption exploded as criminals bribed officials to protect their operations. Violence increased as criminals fought for territory and market share. By 1933, when Prohibition was finally repealed by the 21st Amendment, the consensus was that the policy had been a disaster. It hadn't stopped people from drinking. It had just made drinking illegal and dangerous. It had enriched criminals, corrupted law enforcement, and undermined respect for law itself. Al Capone was a product of this system. He didn't create the market for illegal alcohol. Congress did. He simply built an efficient organization to serve that market. His brutality and corruption were extreme, but they were responses to the incentives Prohibition created. Make something illegal that millions of people want, provide no legal way to obtain it, and criminals will step in to fill the gap. That's not moral philosophy. It's economics. The Untouchables operated within this contradictory context. They were enforcing a law that most Americans violated regularly. Speakeasies operated in most neighborhoods. Many families kept illegal liquor in their homes. Respectable citizens patronized establishments controlled by criminals. The law said one thing, society did another. This created a moral complexity. Were Ness and his team heroes for enforcing the law, or were they enforcers of an unjust policy? The answer depends on your perspective. From a strict law and order viewpoint, they were doing their duty. Congress had passed Prohibition, and federal agents were obligated to enforce it. From a pragmatic viewpoint, they were addressing a legitimate problem. Al Capone was a murderer who'd corrupted an entire city. He needed to be stopped, regardless of whether the underlying law was wise. Ness himself seems to have believed in Prohibition, at least initially. His family background was strongly anti-alcohol. He viewed bootleggers not just as lawbreakers, but as contributing to social harm. But after Prohibition's repeal in 1933, Ness never again spoke strongly in favor of alcohol prohibition. Experience had complicated his views. The historical lesson isn't that Prohibition agents were heroes or villains. It's that law enforcement operates within policy frameworks created by politicians, and when those frameworks are poorly conceived, even honest law enforcement struggles to achieve positive outcomes. The Untouchables were honest, but honesty alone couldn't make Prohibition work. The policy was fundamentally flawed. What they did accomplish was demonstrating that even within a flawed system, integrity remains possible. The law might be questionable, but accepting bribes from murderers isn't. Capone didn't go down solely for violating Prohibition. He went down for tax evasion. That prosecution was legitimate regardless of one's views on alcohol policy. Modern federal law enforcement owes debt to the methods pioneered during the Capone investigation. Several techniques and approaches that seem standard today were innovative in 1930. Financial investigations. The IRS's success in prosecuting Capone for tax evasion established financial crimes as a primary tool against organized crime. Today, agencies routinely follow the money to dismantle criminal organizations. Money laundering statutes, asset forfeiture laws, and financial reporting requirements evolved over decades through multiple cases and legislative changes. But Wilson's methods influenced the philosophy of financial investigation. Integrity testing. The concept of screening agents for integrity, checking their backgrounds and creating teams specifically selected for honesty, became standard practice. The FBI, DEA, and other federal agencies now conduct extensive background checks and financial monitoring of personnel, particularly those working organized crime or corruption cases. The lesson from the Untouchables was clear. In corrupt environments, the investigators themselves must be demonstrably clean. Coordinated task forces. The collaboration between Ness's Prohibition Bureau team, Wilson's IRS investigators, and Johnson's prosecutors pioneered what we now call multi-agency task forces. Modern operations against organized crime, terrorism, and drug trafficking routinely involve multiple agencies pooling resources, sharing intelligence, and coordinating operations. The Capone investigation proved this approach could work, despite bureaucratic complications. Public relations. Ness's understanding that publicity mattered, that visible enforcement actions influenced public perception and criminal behavior, shaped modern law enforcement's relationship with media. Press conferences announcing major arrests and carefully timed information releases serve purposes beyond informing the public. They send messages about government effectiveness and criminal vulnerability. Informant recruitment. Wilson's success in recruiting former Capone insiders as witnesses established informant recruitment as a primary investigative technique. Today's federal prosecutions of organized crime rely heavily on witnesses from within criminal organizations, often offered reduced sentences or immunity in exchange for testimony. The legal framework for this practice, witness protection programs, immunity agreements, plea bargains tied to cooperation, developed from cases like Capone's. However, the Capone case also revealed limitations that persist today. Structural corruption remains difficult. While Ness could raid breweries and Wilson could prove tax evasion, they couldn't dismantle the underlying corruption that had allowed Capone to thrive. The Chicago Police Department remained troubled for decades after Capone's conviction. Political machines continued operating. Organized crime adapted but didn't disappear. Individual prosecutions, even successful ones, don't necessarily reform systems. Prohibition created more problems than it solved. The policy failure that created Capone's empire should have been a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of prohibition policies. Hero worship oversimplifies. The focus on Eliot Ness as an individual hero, while understandable, obscures the reality that successful law enforcement requires systems, not just personalities. Ness was effective partly because George Johnson backed him, Frank Wilson built the tax case, and federal judges weren't corrupted. Remove any of those elements, and Ness likely fails. We celebrate individuals, but institutions matter more. Integrity is necessary, but insufficient. Ness's team was honest, and that mattered. But honesty alone doesn't catch criminals. They also needed competence, resources, legal authority, and persistence. Many honest officers fail because they lack other necessary qualities. Many competent officers fail because they're operating in hopelessly corrupt environments. Success requires multiple factors aligning. At the center of the Untouchables story is a question that remains relevant. Why did they refuse? According to Ness's account, $2,000 per week in 1931. Financial security for life. No more danger. No more threats to their families. No more grinding through night raids and bureaucratic obstacles. Just take the money, look the other way, and live comfortably. They said no. Understanding why requires acknowledging that people are motivated by more than money. Ness and his team had something rarer than wealth, a sense of purpose that couldn't be purchased. They believed the law should mean something. They believed public service should involve actual service, not personal enrichment. They believed that accepting Capone's money would make them complicit in his crimes. These beliefs sound naive. In Chicago in 1930, they were radical, but they were also self-reinforcing. Once Ness publicly emphasized his team's incorruptibility, maintaining that reputation became essential. Once he'd been labeled untouchable by the press, his credibility depended on living up to it. Once his team members had faced dangers based on trust that everyone would stay honest, betraying that trust became unthinkable. Integrity in this sense is partly strategic. Making it public and visible creates accountability. Ness's decision to work with the press about his team's honesty was effective precisely because it created expectations they couldn't abandon. But strategy only goes so far. In the early morning hours, raiding facilities while wondering if Capone's men were planning retaliation. Strategy doesn't keep you going. Something deeper does. Maybe it's pride, refusing to be the kind of person who can be bought. Maybe it's duty, honoring an oath to uphold the law. Maybe it's faith, believing that systems should work the way they're supposed to, even when they don't. Whatever the motivation, it was strong enough to sustain approximately 10 men through 2 years of danger, frustration, and financial hardship. It was strong enough that the team stayed together. That's the real story of the Untouchables. Not that they were better investigators than others, though they were competent. Not that they faced more danger, though they faced real threats. The story is that when offered a choice between integrity and comfort, between principle and money, between what was right and what was easy, they chose the harder path. In 1930s Chicago, that choice was so unusual that it became legendary. The fact that it became legendary suggests how rare it was. The fact that it's still celebrated suggests we recognize how valuable it remains. Al Capone went to prison on October 24, 1931. He'd built an empire worth hundreds of millions. He'd corrupted thousands of officials. He'd terrorized an entire city. In the end, none of it saved him. Eliot Ness died broke on May 16, 1957. According to his account, he'd turned down enough bribe money to make him wealthy for life. He'd become a national hero, then faded into obscurity. He died never knowing that his story would inspire books, television series, and films. There's no obvious moral here. Capone lived comfortably for years before his imprisonment and mental decline. Ness struggled financially for decades after his moment of glory. If you measure success in money or comfort, it's not clear the honest man made the better choice. But if you measure success in legacy, in whether your life meant something beyond personal gain, in whether you stood for principles when standing was costly, in whether you remained yourself even when changing would have been profitable, then the accounting looks different. Today, people visit Alcatraz and see Al Capone's cell. It's a tourist attraction, a reminder of where absolute power and total corruption eventually lead. Meanwhile, people watch The Untouchables and see a dramatized version of Eliot Ness choosing integrity over bribery. It's fiction, but it's based on truth. The man who could be bought ended up in a cage. The man who couldn't be bought ended up a legend. In Chicago, 1929, that outcome was far from certain. It required approximately 10 men choosing principle over profit, day after day, raid after raid, threat after threat. It required Frank Wilson spending months tracking money through financial records and shell companies. It required George Johnson prosecuting a case that made him a target. It required Judge Wilkerson switching juries at the last moment. It required, in other words, a system, broken and corrupt as it was, producing just enough honest people at just the right moment to make justice possible. That's the real lesson. Not that integrity always wins. It doesn't. Not that good always triumphs. It often doesn't. But that in specific moments, in particular circumstances, when people choose principle over pragmatism and persistence over surrender, even the most powerful criminals can be brought down. Al Capone dominated Chicago, but he couldn't control federal agents who refused to be bought. And in the end, that was enough. To take down a man who owned the city, they needed men who couldn't be owned. They found them. They succeeded. The rest is history.